Hopefully this will work. Okay, can you see the main slide page there?
Perfect, Ben.
Yeah, good. Okay, you're not seeing my rubbish garbled notes. That's helpful and very beneficial for you all. I'm Ben. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Adam, and all of you at ACA for inviting me along. Delighted to be with you tonight. I'm a solicitor. I work at the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, and I'm speaking to you from Glasgow tonight. But I studied in Aberdeen. I did my law degree in Aberdeen, so it's very much in my heart. And I'm going to be speaking about how to use human rights law to tackle climate change. And my talk's going to cover really three main areas. The first of which will be making the link between human rights and climate change. And then secondly, I'm going to look at what we have in the human rights toolbox to tackle climate change. And then finally, I'm going to look at some possible uses of human rights law that you could perhaps put into action after this talk to tackle climate change. But first, I'm going to start with a wee plug for ERCS. And I'm also going to try not to cough all the way through this, which I think would be good for you all. We were set up in 2020. We're an environmental law NGO in Scotland. And what we want to see is Scotland where everyone's right to live in a healthy environment is fully realised. And to get to that, we do a number of activities, which includes the provision of free legal advice to individuals, community groups, and NGOs in Scotland on environmental and planning law. That's mainly what I do at ERCS. We also carry out some advocacy, so trying to change the law to make it better, protect the right to live in a healthy environment. So at the moment, we're working on the proposed new human rights bill, which I'll talk a bit about at the end. And we're also trying to change the law in Scotland to make it easier for ordinary people to go to court over the environment. And we also carry out some public legal education through events like this and the provision of some free guides, which we publish on our website. So we've recently published a couple of guides on protest law and environmental impact assessment, which you can find on our website. So moving to the kind of first stage of my talk, linking human rights and climate change, I think it's useful to start by thinking about how human rights and the environment are linked together, first of all. So there's kind of three ways of thinking about this. The first is really relates to the right to a clean and healthy environment. Obviously, that relates to the environment, and that's known as the substantive environmental right. Unfortunately, we don't have the explicit right to a clean and healthy environment incorporated into Scots law at the moment, but watch this space, and I'll come on to that a bit more towards the end. Then there are procedural environmental rights. So they include a kind of trio of rights, really, about rights to access information in relation to the environment. So to find out what's going on in your environment and why decisions are being made. And then also the right to participate in environmental decision making, which Tom was talking about in his talk. And I'm sure Hannah will come on to in relation to planning law later on. And then there's the final one of that trio is about accessing justice, where basically the ability to go to court where environmental laws are not complied with and someone is breaching them. And then the final way of linking human rights and the environment is thinking about other human rights which aren't explicitly environmental but are affected by environmental conditions. So that includes rights such as the right to life or rights to adequate housing. things that are significantly affected by the quality of the environment. Moving to think about how climate change and human rights intersect specifically. So the person in this photo is Professor John Knox, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. And for some reason, he seems to be wearing what looks like a computer mouse on the side of his head, but ignore that. The important thing here is his quote, which really draws the links between climate change and human rights. And he says that basically climate change threatens pretty much the full complement of human rights, including rights to life, housing, food, development, and self-determination. So thinking about a couple of those in a little bit more detail. Well, the right to life is obviously affected by climate change because climate change is driving things like heat waves, droughts, increased spread of diseases, and malnutrition, which all affect mortality. The right to food is also quite significantly affected. So agriculture is obviously affected by heat, droughts, extreme weather events, etc. Housing is also can also be affected by extreme weather events that are kind of turbocharged by climate change. And if you think about small island states and the kind of existential threats that they face from sea level rise, the rights to kind of self-determination and development are strongly affected there as well. I think that it's quite useful to think about climate change through a human rights lens, or to frame climate change as a human rights issue, because, well, for three reasons, really. So firstly, I think human rights provide a useful lens to see who wins and who loses from climate change, and it helps to politicize climate change. It makes us see climate change as something that's more than just a technical, economic, or security issue. Those are the ways it's often framed. And it also provides a yardstick. Human rights provide a yardstick against which you can measure policies and actions and critically assess them, and they can guide policies and actions. And secondly, I think human rights help to shift the motivation on acting on climate change from one of benevolence or charity, which can be ignored or set aside on a whim, to more hard-edged and enforceable legal duties. And then finally, human rights can empower rights holders. So it can change the relationship between the victims of climate change and the powerful actors that often drive climate change. So human rights seek to empower what are known as rights holders, people with human rights, to hold duty bearers to account, to ensure that their rights are respected and upheld. So hopefully I've convinced you of the links between climate change and human rights by now, and we can move on to looking at the human rights toolbox. So the UK is signed up to a number of different human rights treaties, but those treaties only become enforceable in our legal system once they've been incorporated through some form of domestic law. And we've only incorporated one human rights treaty fully into UK law, and that's the European Convention on Human Rights. The European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR, is a human rights text that mainly covers civil and political rights. So it includes rights such as the right to life, the right to freedom from torture, right to liberty, things like that. So the ECHR, it's been incorporated into UK law through this piece of UK legislation called the Human Rights Act 1998. And that's the first source of our kind of human rights tools. So there's a couple of things in that, which I'll just go through with you quickly. The first one is this tool called a declaration of incompatibility. And that's basically the ability of courts in the UK to make a declaration that acts of the UK Parliament are incompatible with ECHR rights. And when you get one of those declarations of incompatibility, it doesn't mean that the offending legislation is then struck down. It's still good law, but it often leads to Parliament having to change the law or deciding to change the law to make it compatible. And the second tool in the 1998 Act is a duty on all public authorities in the UK to act in a way which is compatible with the ECHR. So for our purposes, that includes things like planning authorities making planning decisions, acts by the police, regulatory and permitting decisions. So that's potentially quite a useful tool. Our second source of human rights tools comes from the Scotland Act 1998. So human rights are kind of part of the constitutional framework in Scotland. They're woven into our constitution. And this act sets out the powers of the Scottish Parliament. There's a couple of useful tools within it. So it says an act of the Scottish Parliament is not law if it's incompatible with ECHR rights. And it also says that the Scottish Government cannot act in a way which is incompatible with ECHR rights. It would be unlawful for them to do that. And then just thinking about how human rights have been used in the courts so far, there haven't been an awful lot of attempts in the UK to use human rights law. But globally, we're seeing this happening more and more, and it's actually becoming quite difficult to keep up with all of the developments across the world in this field. I'm just going to go through 3 cases quickly to kind of give you a flavour of how human rights can be used in the court. So the first case here, Juliana, which is the photo on the slide, that started in 2015 in the US. And there were 21 youth plaintiffs who took on the US government and said that the US government, by encouraging the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, was violating their constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. That case was dismissed in 2020 for a lack of standing, and they're currently awaiting a ruling on a motion to basically amend their case. So that's ongoing. It was started in 2015. Urgenda, the second case, that's a more successful, positive story. That started in 2013, and that involved a Dutch NGO and 900 citizens taking on the Dutch government and saying that they had to reduce greenhouse gas emissions more aggressively. And they relied on the right to life and the right to private and family life in the ECHR as part of their argument. That case went all the way to the Dutch Supreme Court. And in 2019, that court found that the ECHR rights that they relied on, the right to life and the right to private and family life, create a positive obligation on the state to protect citizens from activities which could endanger their rights. And the court said that the Dutch government had to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% relative to 1990 levels by the end of 2020. So quite a significant win for them there. Plan B, this is a UK case, the final one on the slide. It started in 2021. Plan B is a charity based in England, and they said that the UK government had failed to take the practical and effective measures that were needed to ensure that the UK meets the temperature requirements in the Paris Agreement. And they said that by failing to do that, they'd breached the rights to life and private and family life, similar life rights that were referred to in our agenda. But that case was refused permission, and it wasn't allowed to go to a full hearing, and the courts have said that it has no realistic prospect of success for several reasons. And from what I understand, Plan B are now appealing to the European Court on Human Rights on that one. So watch that space. Coming then to the final part of my talk on possible uses of human rights law that you could possibly put into effect. Well, the first one, I'm a solicitor, and quite obvious first choice is take on a case, become a litigant, and use human rights law to go to court. And I think human rights law can really be used to potentially to challenge legislation, policies, and decisions of public authorities, which will either worsen or insufficiently mitigate climate change. And we could think of, seeing as you're in Aberdeen, the extraction and production of fossil fuels, so decisions to permit the extraction of fossil fuels would be one. Large infrastructure projects with negative climate implications, such as building roads or airports, might be another one. And even things like fiscal or taxation measures, so maybe extending subsidies on fossil fuels might be another one. There's no kind of closed list of categories of types of decisions or measures which could be challenged. But talking about litigation, it's kind of important to balance that with some of the limitations of going to court, just to bring us back down to earth. So one of the main problems with going to court in Scotland over the environment is the cost of doing so. It's really, really expensive to go to court over the environment. The general rule, if you go to court in Scotland and if your case is unsuccessful, is that you have to pay your own legal costs and the costs of your opponents. And in environmental litigation in Scotland, that often means you're left with a five-figure or potentially a high five-figure or potentially low six-figure bill at the end of a case. So that's a huge barrier, and it really puts people off, as you can imagine. Time limits is another issue. So if you're challenging certain types of planning decisions, you effectively get 6 weeks from the date of a decision to challenge that in court. That's a really short time limit. And in most other circumstances, it'll be 3 months from the date of a decision. Which sounds like quite a lot, but when you think about all the numerous hoops and steps you have to go through to get a case ready to lodge in court, that time limit can really be quite tricky to manage. And then in general, there's a number of drawbacks of going to court, which I've described as the awfulness of lawfulness, and that includes things like the time that it takes, the fact that you'll have to be speaking to obnoxious lawyers like myself quite a lot if you are a litigant, the stress of going to court, and the fact that cases can get wrapped up in procedural oddities and go nowhere for years, such as appears to have happened in the Juliana case. Final slide and final tip for you, or suggestion for something that you could do. The Scottish government is about to consult on developing a new human rights framework in Scotland. So they've committed to passing legislation to create a new statutory framework for human rights protection in Scotland. And in the discussions that have led up to that commitment so far, there have been a number of recommendations to include a substantive right to a healthy environment in Scots law. And I've put the text of the proposed substantive right on this slide, which, as you can see, includes the right to a safe climate. There's a a pre-legislative consultation, which we think is about to be published possibly this month, possibly next month, from the Scottish Government. So something which you could do would be to respond to that consultation and strongly encourage the Scottish Government to ensure that that right is in Scots law and is as strong as possible. So I hope that was useful. That's the end of my talk. I hope it's given you something to think about. And if you want to discuss any of these matters further, obviously there's the question session, but you can also contact ERCS, and my contact details are on the first slide. Thanks.
Great, Ben. Actually, one thing you could do, Ben, is you could just drop your contact details into the chat so anyone can just pick them up.